welcome everyone to a new episode of Blast from the Past. I'll be hosting the episode today, and we have Erik Paulsen on, the former Republican congressman from Minnesota's 3rd congressional district. So thank you very much for coming on.
Great to be with you today. Thanks for taking the time, and congratulations on launching this Blast from the Past effort and series.
Thank you. All right, so the first question I have for you today is about the very beginning of really your interest in politics. So you received a mathematics degree in college, and you did some analytical work on as a side job even while you were serving in the Minnesota State House. So my question for you is, what got you interested in politics after college, and were you ever interested in it at a younger age?
Yeah, great question. I always enjoyed talking with students because I'd get that question from a lot of students that I met with, which was one of the favorite parts I liked about public service or welcoming students to Washington in particular. And my entry to politics was very different than I think most folks. As you mentioned, I was a math major in college, and so I never thought I would embark on a career that went into government or public service in any respect. I would say my first exposure to politics or government probably came when I was in 7th grade. My father had taken me to precinct caucuses, and so I got it's sort of a little foray into what the experience was like. But I do remember on election night, he brought me along that evening to help make some phone calls for a get out the vote effort. Of course, I went along for the donuts and the pop,
Mhm.
and that sort of thing. But I realized that after making some of those phone calls, the representative who won came and thanked the volunteers, and he showed up, and I thought, wow, we just helped that guy. And so that kind of just stuck in the back of my mind. It's like, this is how these candidates are successful. People at the grassroots level actually chip in, they help, and it makes a difference. And so when I was a math major in college, I worked in marketing for a couple of years after graduating, but I did want to do something where I felt like I was uh, helping people or making a difference in their lives. And so I did quit my job after 2 years in marketing. I was moving up fine, and took an internship at that time with U.S. Senator Rudy Boschwitz. And it was
Mm.
just kind of starting over. And so my hope and dream would be, well, maybe I can work for a congressman's office or a senator's office and use my math and business background. And Rudy Boschwitz actually lost his next election, but I was able to hook up with the brand new freshman congressman, my congressman, Jim Ramstad, from Minnesota. And I volunteered in his office for 5 weeks in DC. I went out there and pounded the pavement, did interviews, but essentially he hired me after 5 weeks to be his legislative assistant on the small business committee. So I got to use my math background, I got to use my business background and stay in touch with Minnesota, which was kind of a dream, when you're working for a freshman congressman in particular, because it's part of history in the making. You're not following anyone's footsteps, advising him on
Yeah.
votes. And so that's how I got interested in politics and government, and, never had sort of a long-term career, goal from there, but doors opened up and I ended up running for office myself later.
Fascinating. Thank you. So my follow-up is related to this, and it's a question I've been wondering the answer to about why you decided to run for the Minnesota State Legislature in the first place. Where prior to that, as you mentioned, you worked for Senator Boschwitz and Representative Ramstad, and did he encourage you at all to make a run for State House?
Yeah, actually, what happened was, after working 2 years in Washington for Congressman Ramstad, he did send me back to Minnesota to run his Minnesota office and be the district director. And he was just getting ready for his, first reelection. And so I came back. We were thrilled to come back. My wife and I were thrilled to come back to Minnesota. And then 2 years later, the woman who represented my community, where I lived in Eden Prairie and had grown up right next door, decided to retire. And so it was Jim Ramstad who convinced me essentially to think about doing it myself, because I was always a staffer in the background. So I was 28, 29 years old, and that was my first entrance, putting myself out there. And it wasn't easy because, as someone who was so young, and I'm a really strong encourager of young people getting involved in government and politics. I think it's really needed. But I ended up knocking on 12,364 doors
Oh,
myself that summer, and found out that my youth became an asset rather than a liability because of the energy. And I ended up being elected as the 3rd youngest member in the state house at that time, in Minnesota, the state legislature.
Thank you. So this is kind of an addition to your career in the state house, but you ended up working as majority leader in the state house. And my question was, how did that help prepare you for your service in the U.S. House in terms of understanding legislative procedure and how caucuses function and such?
Yeah, having the opportunity to serve in leadership was really a privilege. It's a little bit like running for class president, I guess. But in my tenure in the state legislature, I had essentially been able to work with all the different sort of coalitions or factions within the Republican conference. And when our governor, who was the majority leader, he became governor, Tim Pawlenty. I ended up becoming the majority leader for 4 years. And I should mention this here. So a lot of people look at the majority leader in politics traditionally as being the person who leads the fight on the floor, takes it to the other side, drives the agenda, can be partisan in nature. But I did not approach it that way. I used it as an opportunity to work with the minority leader and some of those folks in passing legislation, but also building relationships. And what I learned and that transpired into was when the pendulum always swings. So when the Republicans in Minnesota went back into the minority, I ended up passing more legislation in the minority than I did when I was majority leader or in the majority. And so that all came from relationship building. And that really set the path for my belief in terms of being a legislator. If you want to legislate and get things done, you need to work with both sides. And I certainly followed that model myself in Congress. A lot of my colleagues don't or didn't at that time. But I think it's really important and certainly is needed again in today's world to get things done. So it was a lifelong lesson that worked for me when I eventually ran for Congress and was successful in passing some legislative initiatives in Congress nationally.
Yeah, thank you. So my next question actually relates to your congressional campaign, your first one in 2008, and you ran to succeed your former boss, Congressman Ramstad, in the House. And obviously didn't have any primary opposition. But in the general election, it was a very Democratic year nationwide, especially for House seats. So the race that you had that year was more competitive per se than some of the other races you faced during your career. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that campaign, what your message was, and how you ended up succeeding.
Yeah, it was a really challenging environment, as you mentioned. We were just coming off the heels of the Iraq War, and President Bush was, quite unpopular at that time, and there were a lot of Republicans who were disenfranchised at the level of spending going on in Washington, and so there was kind of a real challenge in terms of having an open seat when Ramstad announced his retirement, and he encouraged me to run right away. And at one time there were potentially 12 or 14 candidates, and I was able to essentially secure a lot of support around myself. I didn't have a primary, and I emerged as the one candidate, but it was a tough election, to make no doubt about it. With a lot of money, we were outspent significantly from outside resources. But I think one of the key factors there was my focus was on making sure that the Republicans were focusing on what they always had promised that they would do, right? Or should, we should be accomplishing things that we had promised we would do on spending, on driving economic growth, and not just going along to just to go along for going along's sake. And so, and then working across the aisle, I think was another message, important message. So, you know, and President Obama won my district that year. That was the year he was, first running for president. And so, Minnesotans are ticket splitters, and so they vote more for the candidate than the party, which I think is really important. And so that ended up working well for me in terms of getting through that election. But it was a challenge, and those are always nail biters. There were only two of us, by the way, Harrison, nationally, myself and Leonard Lance from New Jersey.
Yeah, my old congressman. Yeah.
Yeah, and we came in together in a class. We were the only two, I believe, that we had our own little caucus that won as Republican House members in Obama districts. So
Yeah.
part of it, I think, is just our reputation of actually doing things across the aisle, which is what voters were looking for, and I think especially today are looking for.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating how you mentioned that it was an Obama district because even the district in its new form after 2012 was a Clinton district, and you won it by a large amount in 2016 as well. So definitely a good point about ticket splitting in Minnesota. Minnesota is also known for its consistently high turnout, even when the rest of the country may have low turnout.
One of your big legislative accomplishments was the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which you helped write. Are there any other legislative actions that you took during your tenure that you remain proud of?
Yeah, well, first of all, you mentioned, passing the tax reforms, which are really important. I come from a state or a district that has a lot of innovation and medical technology and Fortune 500, 100 companies. You think of like the Medtronics of the world, the 3Ms, the Best Buys, the Targets, those are all anchored they're located here in Minnesota. But we were in a period of time where a lot of these companies essentially were looking to move out of the country, right, through inversions and using the tax code. And so a big part of that tax reform was aimed at keeping those jobs at home. And since we passed that reform, and I know there are folks that are opponents or argue against it still, but we haven't had any inversions. Essentially, we've really invested a lot more back home in manufacturing and keeping those headquarters here in the United States, which has been really important. But I would say the one legislative area that I really had no idea I would spend time focusing on, but I did as I realized how impactful and how important it was in the area of combating human trafficking or sex trafficking. And I ended up spending time after a newspaper series ran in the Star Tribune about these young teenage girls who were 12, 13 years old. They weren't old enough to have a driver's license or go to their prom, but they were being trapped in these human trafficking situations and essentially ripped from their families. And it was a terrible ordeal. And so I met personally with some of these victims, and they are victims, but they were being treated many times as criminals for prostitution or drugs or alcohol. And so I took my case to the House Majority Leader at that time, Eric Cantor, and said, you need to read these. Some of us have some initiatives that will make a difference that really save lives here. And he took us up on it. And we very quickly assembled a group of us that had legislative proposals. We did sort of a best practices analysis with some students from Stanford. We looked at what was working in certain states, and we passed a series of bills within that year. Some now are in law, and we're hearing success on, where it's really literally saving lives. And so there's been nothing that has been more meaningful to me personally as the father of 4 daughters. It really grabbed my attention at that time, and very bipartisan as well. And so that was very impactful. I still think about that quite often and want to stay involved in that issue.
Thank you, Congressman.
Sorry. You were part of many notable bipartisan House caucuses during your tenure, including the Climate Solutions Caucus and the Congressional Arts Caucus. How do these align with your commitment to pragmatic policymaking as a member of the Republican Main Street Group?
Yeah, that's a great point or a great question. Some of these caucuses that exist between members of both sides in Congress can be very impactful in terms of forming legislation, forming relationships. And the reason I joined some of those caucuses you mentioned, the Arts Caucus, as well as the MedTech Caucus, which I led on a bipartisan basis, the Climate Solutions Caucus, was we were looking for opportunities to bridge the partisan divide that can be accentuated on some of those, more potent issues like climate change, for instance, and then, actually build some coalitions to actually pass some votes, which we were able to do, and start those conversations, which were really important. And I think on issues like climate, as an example, where I first got elected to Congress, didn't know a lot about it, but learned more about it and learned how even the military was concerned about this as a security issue. We learned there were some opportunities to make some differences. So we had to do some more education, some more listening, some more learning, and then trying to lead on some of these issues, right? And it's a good way of targeting younger voters in particular, for those of us who want to see the Republican Party pay attention to what younger voters care about, which is really needed, I think, as well. And so those caucuses can be very helpful, primarily in building relationships with folks on both sides of the aisle. And I'm really hopeful that in the new Congress, we'll see some of those caucuses emerge once again for bringing forward legislative proposals.
Mhm. Thank you. I find it particularly interesting looking at the Climate Solutions Caucus because recently there's been a decline in Republican membership in that caucus because quite a few members unfortunately lost re-election in 2018 in terms of the Republican membership. So that's one that I thought it was interesting you were a part of because in particular, it's one that I thought it would be cool to see expand again over the next few terms in Congress.
Yeah, I think this is going to be one of those things where we will see sort of the pendulum swing back, and you'll see some members in the Republican House joining that caucus or paying more attention to that issue. It was true in 2018. Many of us who were, trying to highlight the importance of some of those issues of conservation, environmental protection, paying attention to these climate issues, we're not successful in our election, and all of a sudden you got members that are in deep red districts, that it's just not a priority for them as much. And so, I think even after this last election where now you have a narrower majority in the House, certainly I think you're going to see some members that do represent some of these communities and districts that are going to be more pragmatic, that are going to be more supportive and willing to engage on those issues and think more for the future, not only for themselves in caring for their constituents, but also building the brand for, for the Republican Party as an example, or working with more moderate Democrats that want to find some practical solutions to these that aren't going to cost, significant amounts of economic growth or jobs, for instance, which has been a concern for a lot of Republicans over time.
Mhm. Thank you. So the last question that we have has to do with the congressional makeup of Minnesota at the moment in the House. And it reads, the last two congressional races in the third district have dealt difficult blows to Minnesota Republicans. Well, the state party has successfully flipped three seats from blue to red for the U.S. House, the first district and the seventh district, both of which flipped, or sorry, yeah, but the first and the eighth district, both of which flipped in 2018, and the seventh, which flipped this last election. They haven't had the same success in the suburban districts post 2018, so the second district and the third district. And my question for you as a former representative is, what should the GOP do in terms of their campaign message, which candidates they run, to tailor a package essentially that stands the best chance of winning these seats back in the future?
Yeah, Minnesota is a little bit like what's going on in the rest of the country, where you see a lot of rural communities have been tending to go more Republican, and suburban or urban obviously have gone more Democrat. So, in Minnesota, it's fine if you win some new districts in rural Minnesota, which is important. And we've got some successful campaigns that have done that for Republicans. But you can't ignore the reality that it's the suburban districts that in essence, in the end, will be the governing majority for either party, right? And so, for those of us who want to see a pragmatic, sort of the old Ronald Reagan sort of view of conservatism, where if you agree with me 70-80% of the time, you're not my enemy, you're my friend and ally. You can build coalitions within your party to don't think you have to be a purist on everything or use harsh language on certain issues like immigration, for instance, or being supportive of environmental protection and conservation, and highlighting those issues, or the accomplishments around human trafficking, for instance, and why that's important, rather than just traditional, it's only taxes that Republicans care about, and Democrats only care about certain issues. And some of that has been sort of turned on its head lately, I think, with President Trump, becoming more, I would say, of a sort of a protectionist realm within the Republican Party. And I've always been of the view that, trade and economic freedom is a bedrock principle for the Republicans, for instance, and we should be talking about why it's important to buy or to sell American goods and services around the world, where 96% of the world's consumers live, and our innovation will be successful. So then we can keep the jobs here, the innovation here, the headquarters here of these companies, and continue to grow and expand. And part of that message, I think, needs to be sold more confidently to Republicans in the suburbs, in particular suburban women, that want to make sure that their representatives aren't using uncivil, harsh language, but they actually care and they actually want to pay attention to helping people, because that's what legislating and government public service is making a difference in people's lives. And so you can give people a hand up rather than a handout, but part of that is your communication, and words matter, and how you present yourself. So it's certain there's huge opportunities, I think, for Republicans to do that now in Minnesota, in the suburbs. And so I'm really optimistic looking forward, but it's going to take some time and work.
Thank you. It's definitely fascinating looking at that, particularly in taking a look at how possibly Republicans can claw back some of their suburban coalition in the post-Trump era going forward into the new administration. So I appreciate your analysis there.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman Paulsen.
Thank you.
Armin, do you want to lead us out on the interview?
Thank you very much, Congressman Paulsen, for your time. I'm Armin Thomas, and with me is Harrison Lavelle. We will be back with another episode of Blast from the Past soon enough, so tune in when that gets released. Thank you.